Oh, so by the way, before it's Xtag.
Xtag. I'm an
Yeah.
idiot.
Yeah. All right. Are we on air? Oh,
Yeah, we're
yeah.
still. We're still. I can
Okay.
edit this.
All right.
Shh. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 21. We are joined today with Daniel Buchner, creator of the web components library Xtag. Thanks for coming and welcome, Daniel.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing? Can you just tell everybody kind of what you've been doing lately and what Xtag is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Xtag, I created it with help from my buddy Arron Schaar when we were at Mozilla. I worked at Mozilla for 5 years. I was the product manager for the developer ecosystem there. So, had our fingers into apps, all the different web developer stuff, some stuff in MDN. And part of what we saw in the developer ecosystem was an inability really to cohesively build apps close to the DOM, close to the affordances that the browser already provided. So right when we saw web components, we really jumped on that bandwagon and got in there with the working group from W3. People like Dmitry Glaskov, Alex Komorowski, Alex Russell, and thought that was going to be huge. So the initial blog post about Shadow DOM from Dmitry a long time ago looked at that and said, okay, this is where we should place our bet. This is where the future of web development is going to go. And so, started getting with them and actually, really working in the working group for W3 on those specs. So, after about 3 or 4 months of talking with them, and actually kicking around ideas, and they had a lot of stuff fully formed already. We started contributing. We do meetings and stuff with them, and it began to take shape. Xtag began to take shape when I started to realize that essentially we had this blank canvas with custom elements specifically, and the other 3 specs that we were working on were all, they're kind of enhancements essentially to custom elements. HTML imports, great way to deliver custom elements and templates. Template, great way to stamp out the guts of your custom element. And then Shadow DOM, if you wanted a complex custom element and you don't want stuff to leak or be selectable. That maybe shouldn't be or should just be internal to the component, that's a nice wrapper. But everything is really the vehicle of custom elements. So we recognized that pretty quick, and Arron and I kind of looked at each other. I went off one weekend and wrote what was Xtag, like the 1.0, or not 1.0, but like the first draft version, and brought it back to him next week with the group of developers and say, hey, I think this could be a big thing. Like we should maybe continue working on this. And Arron really liked it. It was split. The camp was split at first. It was sort of like people saying, "Oh, that's not everything needs to be declarative," and I don't know about this shady world of tags. And I was like, "Well, it's HTML." So we developed it, and we had to prove to our own people internally that was maybe the right course, and that was just as much a sales job because that's how Mozilla operates internally as it was externally to other developers. But we made the case and proceeded with the implementations in Firefox, and I sort of oversaw stuff with folks like Blake Kaplan, William Chen, who's the other guy working on the platform side of things, and developed Xtag out and had a developer resource dedicated to it, and really got it to a place where I thought that it took the custom element spec and made it really sort of sharpened it for app UI creation. So custom element's great. It kind of gives you this really minimal blank canvas and hooks that you need into lifecycle portions of elements. When they're added, when they're removed, when they're created. But that's it. It leaves it there for you. Here's a blank prototype. So what Xtag does is it really just says let's do a little bit more. Let's give you like an easier way to bind events on there. Let's kind of build it out a little bit. While still staying true to the look and feel of the API. So that's kind of how Xtag came to be. Since that time, Arron and I both have moved on. He's at Kraken he's big into Bitcoin, as am I. I'm over at Target, and that's the actual retailer with the bullseye. It was an interesting move.
Target.
Target, yeah. I got an offer to go over there and work for the research and development group as a PM over there. So I do some fun stuff. Still working on custom elements, and we actually joined the W3. So that was a huge thing. First retailer ever to join the W3, and we're now working on some services stuff, and still pushing open source there. So.
I didn't even realize that. Congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you.
It's interesting your history too, because you're a product manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're also a developer. So like going back, looking at, you were in a very good position to work with the people working on the specs and make this, more developer friendly and usable. Do you feel that that's the case, or do you feel that you've made a pretty good contribution in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel I have an interesting perspective anyway, because I went to business school, so I never took a CS class, and that's something I just learned on my own doing a startup in college. Did the business side, didn't really have any clarity into the app and the world of a developer and what they have to go through, but thought that it was important. Like my dad always said, that you have to know everything about your business. He was a small business owner, and he did everything. He had to do every part of it. So I wanted to do the same thing. So I kind of just self-taught. And that sort of mentality, I think, is helpful, because when you come in and look at specs, you're looking at it from a really different vantage point. Like the ergonomics, you see that differently. You're not seeing paradigms that were taught to you in a classroom that, maybe in one scenario in a book, they work really well, but then how does it look, feel, and actually work in production? So that was helpful, and I was able to give good feedback and have some changes to the specs, and things that we moved it in the right direction, I think.
That's awesome. How did it influence the creation of Xtag? Like, was it during the time that you guys were working on these, or was it after? Like, how did that work?
We code, so they had the basic format for how you would do custom elements. Like when we walked into it, they had an idea. At that point, they still had the declarative format that's now been sort of deprecated and put on indefinite hold, and that's the idea of actually having like an element, sort of like Polymer -element, and that was actually in the specs for a while. We encountered some interesting problems in the HTML5 parser that made that very difficult. So we actually just said, okay, let's just go with imperative only. It's rather straightforward. That was born out of feedback we got from developers, us working with it. So we did actually develop Xtag and kind of came back to them with, here's what we're seeing, like you can kind of make a declarative element like Polymer element with the imperative side. So we don't need to spend time hashing out these real difficult technical problems if we can still get to it with, this other more closer to the metal sort of API. So that, there's huge changes. Document.register became document register elements, all these other things. Some of it from our feedback, other just from natural evolution.
We had Poch and Sol on for a previous episode, and they talked a lot about how Xtag was a big influence in the early stages for Brick, and now they've moved away from that to use the native components. How do you feel that happened? Like what happened with that, I guess, is the question.
I don't know exactly, because after I left, I don't know what the decision process was. I saw certain things here and there. We weren't there anymore. Arron left probably 2-3 months after I did. Mm-hmm. So I don't maybe they felt like, who's going to maintain this or something like that. I've looked at the components too. I think that going native is perfectly fine, especially if you want things to have like absolute zero dependencies. You don't want to list a single one. That's always a nice thing. I do think Xtag, if you do some comparative examples, I think that Xtag does slim down components sometimes as much as like 40-50%, which is helpful, but it all depends on your use case. If their use case is, we want this to, we don't want to make any library that works on any one browser better, not that Xtag does, it works on all of them, but we don't want to have that extra layer. If that's your use case, then that's great. And actually it might be, because I think that the Firefox OS needs were that they were only going to work with, that was kind of their mandate on that side. We're only going to work with the native stuff, and we're going to write everything longhand. So that might have played a role.
I think too, accessibility for the Gaia level, the Gaia UI for Firefox OS. I believe Poch and Sol talked about that. Sol more so. But yeah, so they're not using Brick, I think. They're using the special Gaia components because of the accessibility. Was that ever factored in with accessibility because that's something that just to kind of go on a side note, like a lot of the web components demos get knocked for, and we talked about this in the brick episode as well. But do you have plans to add accessibility to Xtag, or does it already have it?
Yeah, so we actually have plans for accessibility and localization. Those are things that we kind of want to make. Xtag kind of has one big top-level object if you look at how to create an element. And there's certain things on there. There's real high-level things that we've had since the beginning, like accessors, which are like getters and setters that link to attributes, events, lifecycle. And we want to add something for localization and accessibility that makes it easy to say, what is this thing? Point at the pieces inside that do X, Y, and Z roles, with ARIA and those other things you can do to add accessibility layers, and just do it for you. So we're planning on doing that. It's just we just hit 1.0, and I added hooks for Shadow DOM if you want to include it. There's an easy way to add your Shadow DOM using Xtag. It doesn't require it. It's kind of just if it's in the environment, it'll use it for you. So those are things we're just kind of building out.
That's really something I wanted to ask you about too. With Polymer, it's almost always declarative, right? And Potch had argued that when we talked about brick, that how much logic do you want in your markup? You could do it imperatively, or you can do it declaratively, because we talked about non-UI elements and being creative with those. Similar to your talk in San Francisco HTML meetup group. So when we're dealing with that, does Xtag allow you to do a declarative and an imperative way of dealing with web components?
No, actually, it's strictly imperative, and that's completely on purpose. We have ways that you can add blocks for your content, like your template, like you would have in the Polymer element. And here's the reason. I mean, this is no knock on Polymer, but it's actually true, right? Everything you build on top of, I love using declarative elements. I love using the outputs of the APIs, right? Like I like using my declarative elements, marking up my page with them. But to declare an element declaratively, there's certain advantages, but it's also, we have to realize at the underlying it is still the imperative API. That's the only thing that's really native. So what is actually happening is they created an element, and it's doing this translation. So all it is a layer of abstraction. If you enjoy that type of abstraction, awesome. If you want something that's more terse, that is closer to like what that real API is going to look like, that's what we did with Xtag. Because we didn't see a whole lot of value enough to justify saying, let's create this abstraction layer on top that essentially filters down and then talks to the imperative APIs. And if you look at some of the code comparisons, we can instantiate a component in a trivial amount of characters. And I know characters don't mean everything, but it also looks pretty clean. It's like, here it is,
One of the things that really struck me as very interesting about Xtag, and I haven't built anything with it yet, to be honest, but it looks really interesting with when you did a few demos that I saw, and it's a fairly, comparatively to Polymer, probably about the same size, but it's like a large config that you pass into some global object, similar to Polymer in that sense. But what was interesting was when you do a Polymer element and you do it, declaratively, even though it is imperative underneath, you get all or nothing, right? Shadow DOM is added, templates are added, imports are added. It's all there because that's the way that Google and the rest of us see web components working together. But if you wanted to just make a custom element and you didn't want Shadow DOM, or you wanted to have just pieces of these specs in here, you really can't do that with Polymer. You can create a native element and work with Polymer in that, but you can't really do that, by itself with Polymer. So I noticed that you have mixins inside of this. Can you talk about the mixins and what those are?
Yeah, so we wanted to add ways that you could mix in, interesting functionality that would be reused across elements. So one common pattern, right, is something that we have. There's like a request mixin or SRC mixin. So it makes a live source attribute. So essentially, if you have an element that you would want to make work like a script, because really a script is pretty intricate. Like when you actually look at a script element, it seems simple. It's like, oh, well, I put a source and then there's the source. But what is that really doing? I mean, you're giving it a resource URL. It has all these fetch stages. It's checking a cache. It's like fetching stuff with Ajax, it's, technically that's what it's doing. Putting it back there, rendering the stuff, giving you certain event hooks. There's all this complexity that's really around this one attribute, because there's not a whole lot special about source. I mean, what you type in it is just characters, right? It just knows to evaluate them as JavaScript. So what we did was say, well, what if you could just snap out that one piece, source, or for input elements, value, right? The idea that this value is reflected when there's a change in a UI piece. And we could say that's a mixin. And if you wanted an element like xfoo, and you're saying, you know what, this xfoo, it kind of does this fetch thing where just like an image or a script, you give it a source, and it goes and grabs that, whatever that thing is, and then it delivers it to you. So mixins allow you to say like xtag.mixins, and then you can hang off like whatever that name is of your mixin, so like .src or value, and then you give it an object, which is the same exact declaration as an xtag register element object. So it's the exact same look as a regular object. It's just however much you want to populate it with. You could add lifecycle hooks in there, accessors, whatever you want. And those things, when you reference them in the mixins property on your main like registration object, it goes and grabs those identical formatted objects, essentially those definition objects, and merges them. So if you have a lifecycle on your xfoo element, and you have a lifecycle, hook on your, source element, your source mixin, it's going to merge them. So it'll call both, and it knows to kind of wrap the functions so they're called in the right order and everything. So that's kind of our approach to mixins, is saying like let's snap out little pieces of element functionality that can be reused across multiple elements, and allow you to bring in that imperative code to just give you those powers.
So all at the global scope. So you wouldn't be doing this with like modules or anything like that.
It's all on the xtag object. So if you want to declare a mixin, you say xtags.mixins.src, or whatever the name is of your mixin. And you just make sure that those things are loaded in the head, or in the above your element code. So as long as they're there and they're on there, Xtag will read your element definitions and say, oh, look, there's the src mixin. And then let me look at the xtag.mixins to see if that's there. If there's something there, grab it and merge it in.
It only gets called once in that case. So what if you wanted to have something happen in a certain order that's not necessarily the order that Xtag would put it in? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, so we actually have this system called pseudos. We call them, they're functional pseudos. So if you look at some of our code, you'll see that in the keys there's the keys are strings, right? And you'll see that they have these. It almost looks like CSS pseudos inside. Right. And it's like, so let's take an event example. Like we have custom events already baked in, even though the library is only 12K. We have things like tap down, tap up. Like it kind of unifies it across all input types. And you could say tap : delegate, and then put like a CSS selector in there. And so what that does is gives you the ability just to have delegation, right? To say, I'm placing this event on the element itself, but I actually want to delegate and only act when this CSS selector element type is clicked inside of it. So it's the same sort of thing. What that basically does is takes those pseudos, those keys, and compiles a function tree. So you have your tap function, and then it's kind of filtered by delegate, and then you could put other stuff too. Like in other libraries, there's a concept of like only do this once. So you could make a pseudo that's once. So no matter what function you put it on, whether it's inside of events, accessors, lifecycle, whatever, you click it, it'll happen once. And it sort of wraps your stuff so that happens. So what we did for mixins was we have a mixin pseudo where you can say after or before, and you can specify the mixin names. So you can say, like, Xtag usually always does before, so that you can act last, because we always feel like the element itself should act last. It should kind of get the last crack at like this thing's about to be codified and done. So here you can act on it. If you wanted to go after, you could say after or before, so that your code is inserted around the mixins.
That's pretty awesome. I really like this concept of the mixins that you have in there. It's something that is missing from Polymer. I think Polymer is an awesome library, and I love using it, and it's a very easy way for people to get into it. The mixins kind of remind me of what I want to do with this, with like Angular directives. Are you familiar with?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would want to pass like an attribute directive onto something like a custom element, but I want it to affect things inside of it. But because of that encapsulation with Shadow DOM, that's going to be a lot of overhead to code.
Yeah, it's it does it. I mean, it makes your component stuff just so much lighter going this route. It's something that we kind of ran into early because we saw ourselves repeating code a lot, and that's that was what I really took from Mutual was this dry mentality, right? Like everything I wanted to be as minimalist as possible. Like you shouldn't repeat yourself. So we wanted a way that was just better, that was saner. That if something was wrong with a value thing, you know exactly where to go. It's this shared piece, and I'll link you to a live example here. So there's this input. We have this kind of super input element. It handles it's a flexbox thing internally. It's got a text input inside of it. You can throw buttons inside, and it knows to style them and kind of put them in the right places. It's got a spinner that's kind of there. So if you want to say if you start typing and hit, you can say there's this enter spins type attribute where if you hit it, you can tell it if the person hits enter and it passes this validation, then go ahead and throw a spinner, and it'll spin the element. So you can see here that this is how you reference the value mixin if you check out the registration.
We'll put this in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, and then you can also I haven't converted this one yet, but if you see up at the top, we have a few methods that hang off the Xtag global object. One of them is create fragment, and you can actually do multi-line fragments. This is one reason we were like, okay, templates are cool, but really, what do they resolve to in the end? They resolve to document fragments. So why go the extra parse step? Let's just talk to the JS interpreter directly, Mm-hmm. So we actually have that multi-line ability to have a block of HTML. Looks a lot like a template, except it's speaking directly, of course, to the JS engine. So that's something we actually moved down into the Xtag register thing. We have a content property, and you can use that exact same format, that functional multi-line comment format, to paste in your template. So you don't even need to have something hanging off in the ether of your closure.
So that you have the content equals your fragment clone node. So that's similar to how you would inject templates, right? So, or is that what it's doing underneath?
Yeah. So in Polymer, that's exactly. It's funny if you actually look into Polymer. Obviously, all the names are different and the setup's slightly different, but it all resolves to something that's something very Xtag-esque, down below. Like it all kind of looks like that. It's eventually it's going to take that template and it's going to stamp it out, place it in your component. We just kind of said, we don't. The layer of abstraction, it's really a choice. It's like, do you enjoy that style? If you do, then great, go for it. It does have some advantages. Obviously, you can bring it in. You bring it in through HTML imports. That makes sense. It's HTML. Our stuff, we advise a little bit different. We say, you should put the elements you want evaluated right away because they're necessary for the layout of the page in the head. Have it block. I know it's like Steve Satter's, or the Jank Busters over at Google will probably gasp at that, but I want to say have those block because that's your layout of your page. Maybe you want to do some sort of animation or something while it's going briefly, and then put all the rest with deferred script tags at the bottom of your code. And that's just the same thing, and you don't even technically need an import. I mean, this is like I guess this is web components heresy here, but
it's all such a new way of thinking about the DOM. Just similar to virtual DOM and React, it's just a different way of taking the advances of what's happening in the browsers and sort of figuring out, well, what works best for me.
Yep.
This is great. I noticed on your GitHub for the actual library, you have 0 issues outstanding. They're all resolved.
Yeah, we try and knock them out. I mean, that's the one interesting part is we took the simplistic route. Not simplistic, I won't say simplistic. We took a route that said, this is the 80% case. Over half the elements you ever create will not even need any DOM inside of them. They won't need structural DOM. You could always add them as enhancements or stuff like that afterward, but a lot of them are just purely here's an element and I react to what's put inside me. I'm a gallery and I have image elements inside. You don't really need a lot of other stuff. You can manipulate what's put in. So given that, and the ability to address IE9, which we have. We have a couple polyfills we add. I think a DOM token list and a couple other things that we add to the light polyfill that allow it to go down to Android 2.4 and IE9. And we said, look, there's still a lot of people, decent amount of people on IE9, definitely a decent amount of people on Android 2.4. And
2.3
that
also.
3 and below anything really below 4.1, which is I think what Polymer targets is like 4.1 or something.
4.0, I think it is.
4.0?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we wanted to capture those folks, and it didn't really take a lot. All we had to say is, look, you're going to use this way anyway. I wouldn't advise using Shadow DOM right now. Like if you're Facebook, if you have a real app, maybe not even obviously Facebook status, but if you have something that's out there that's being used by hundreds of thousands of people, maybe it's not the right time yet to say let's expose this all to this polyfill, because it's a really intense polyfill. I mean, there's some polyfills that are light. You can look at language polyfills, right? 4 each on array. Pretty simple. You're working with imperative code. It's going to work. It's a few lines. The polyfill for Shadow DOM is arcane, and that's not because of what Google guys or their failure to do something right. It works for the most part. It's pretty darn good. It's about as close as you can get to native, but just because of that API's inherent difficulty and all the stuff that is required inside the browser to make it happen, it's extremely difficult to polyfill with one-to-one parity.
That particular polyfill stamps out encapsulation, which is not easy to do, right? The Bosonic framework, we had Raphael Rougeron, you probably know.
Yep.
And he spoke about his Shadow DOM polyfill that works backwards to IE9, and that's because it conforms to composability over encapsulations, doesn't have that overhead. Did you take a similar approach with what you did to get that IE9 and Android use case?
So did we use some sort of composability strategy to be able to achieve it? Is that what the question is?
Yeah, and I'm in particular interested in how you got back to 2.4 for Android too.
Well, we tested there, and it was just we didn't see too much issue with it. I mean, really, if you had the DOM tokenless polyfill, like I think it was classless, a couple other things, you can get down that far.
Yeah.
We haven't tested that in a while, so I wouldn't take that as gospel, but we're
you heard it here.
Yeah. Now that 1.0 is out, as of I guess 2 weeks ago, what we're planning on doing is going through and getting a really, really granular compatibility range. So we know it goes down to IE9. We know it works on, I think it's iOS 5 or Safari 5, that far.
Oh wow, that's good.
And we want to walk it back as far as we can, and then we'll go and try and solve issues, and add little bits to the polyfills, like we already have. We worked with Google on this polyfills, and had some contributions there, and we'll continue to do so. If we can push back some stuff into that light web components build, then we'll do that, because why not have the community get more browsers for free? There's no reason not to.
A lot of developers I talk to who haven't been exposed to web components too complain when they play with it that oh my gosh, this is so heavyweight. Why is all this stuff here? And I'm like, dude, they're adding all this functionality, and it just doesn't exist. I mean, once it exists, it's not going to be necessary. This will go away. But the reality for some people is, a lot of our clients here we have on IE9, right, and mobile back to older Android. So that definitely causes some issues. We're looking into Windows mobile compatibility too now, but that's a whole other bag of worms or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if the listeners, if this is interesting, but I'll talk about IE. Why is IE9 that kind of that terminal barrier between compatibility farther back? And so it goes. It's an interesting story. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with kind of the origins of components, but I talk about this in the slide deck that maybe we'll link to or something on the podcast for the quantum leap in web components talk.
It's a great talk.
And that talk goes over the sort of the beginnings, which is the HTC files from Microsoft. So hypertext component files were the beginning of web components. Really, it was 1999. Chris Wilson, who now works at Google, worked heavily on the audio spec and all these other things, and he's working on platform stuff. He wrote it, actually. He wrote it with some other people from Microsoft, and it was this sort of one-off HTML-esque DSL where you could include, bring over and include an HTC file, kind of like an import. The bindings were weird, like you bound them to elements through CSS. So like you would say, here's a behavior, but you could also have tags. And all this stuff was actually out like in the beginning of 2000. And it was in, it was IE 5.5, I want to say it was 5.5. And it was super interesting because they used to have these behaviors and all these hooks. And so it was cool because you could actually use all those exact same hooks to really do a polyfill back to almost the Stone Age. But something happened when IE8 came out. I don't know if everyone remembers. Kind of IE8 was this weird sort of hybrid monster where it was like half standards compliant, and then it was like, half still cruddy, and they were pulling things out and leaving things in all over the place. And one of the things they pulled out was the ability to do CSS behaviors, and that was the hook. That was like the hook you need, right? So there's this gap. It's just for IE8 where there's no way to do those old school mutation events because they hadn't added that standard yet, even though they were pursuing standards, which would come in IE9. And they had removed the old way of essentially including components and binding them, which left you with this no man's land in IE8, which presents this hard barrier to polyfills. Which, if they had just done one of two things, added the standard yet crappy mutation events from olden days, or just left in what they had for one more release, we would be having a different conversation about like old IE and components.
That's actually awesome. I remember using those HTC files with the ping fix from Twin Helix.
Yeah.
So that was like a very popular one for IE6, and
Yep.
It was pretty complex for me at that time. I was like, whoa, I don't know about this, but it wasn't standards like you said, so it was a little crazy to use. So I was so glad to not have to use that. I think one of the issues too with IE9 in particular is, okay, now we can get these polyfills for this, but a lot of times things like you wouldn't expect, like pointer events and placeholder, things that are sort of assumed before you even get to that level of custom elements, custom events and things like that. They're just not in IE. So now you have these series of polyfills on top of that.
Yep.
So it provides a lot of overhead for development, and a lot of companies don't realize that or can't get off of IE9 because of their user base.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a serious discussion internally at most companies and agencies about what does the client need, or if you are the client, you are the company. What is the realistic fiscal monetary contribution of the users that are on these old browsers? What does it take to maintain them, and what is it holding you back from? Because that's the thing, right? You drop 2% of your users in your Google, you've just lost $100 million or whatever that equates to, $200 million.
Yeah.
If you drop 2% of your users on some other apps, if you have like a trading app or apps that are targeted tools for people who really want to use your product, and it's not like it's not drive-bys. They're actually there. They're spending time. It's an app. The idea that they won't upgrade one browser version, that oh no, that's it, I'm not using your app anymore. It's the web. It's not like this native app that like old King's Quest that won't run in your DOS emulator or something. It's like people will just update your browsers. They'll do it. So that's one interesting thing with Arron's. I'll talk a little bit about Arron Schaar, the guy who did contributed a fair amount of code as we went along the process of creating Xtag. He works at Kraken, which is a Bitcoin exchange, and for him, his discussion with developers there to integrate custom elements, which he's doing, was pretty trivial. It was like, we have traders. It's a tool. We can tell them, we could have told them in the old days, download this Java Swing app, and they would have done it, right? They're going to do it because that's the tool. Like, it's just this window that pops up. They're not looking at it in terms of technology or like hassle with upgrading. They're like, what do I need to trade? So Arron and their team was like, okay, great, IE10, whatever, we don't care. We can track latest release because all we have to do is message our users through a really nice email that says, look, it's better for us if we can get you on better web technology. So we want to upgrade our tool, and we want to upgrade for you. Sell it as an enhancement. Be the Steve Jobs of sort of web design.
Sometimes it's a uphill battle with corporations. I think more so large corporations and governments.
Yep.
Dealing with that is much more difficult than having the conversation with a startup or even a small corporation.
Yeah, large corporations and government, everything's harder, right?
In general, for the front end at least.
Yeah, I work. There's things at Target we work together, and I think they're actually pretty forward thinking. If you look at what we're doing with Target and the R&D and getting into W3, but when you get to a certain size, it really doesn't even matter. You could be the most technically forward organization. There's always like a group internally that needs the tool to do this, or it needs to be in this environment. So it is tough. You have to weigh all these options.
Look at like the Lego website. That's got so much content on there, so much visuals and media.
Yeah.
I can imagine Target would be very similar. I mean, Scott Gell, he does responsible responsive design, I think was his book. he just released. He and Filament Group worked on that site for Lego, and that was that's pretty fast. I mean, across mobile and everything. It's off topic from web components and everything, but that shows that these things are possible for large corporations to get that backwards compatibility and have great technology.
Yeah, and the one thing, it actually does segue nicely back into web components, because if you can make the jump, if you can make that jump to web components with whatever framework you use, I'd love if you used Xtag. I really like it, but at the end of the day, I want people to use the web technology I think is going to be best for them. But if you make that jump to just components, period, what you get is the ability to not have so many of these internal discussions necessary in the future. So think of things like speed and responsiveness, like you talked about, and the picture element, right? It was this big thing to get picture element in because it was going to, intelligently, it does intelligently load your assets for you, right? Here, if it's this screen size, this resolution, grab this image. Well, pre-web components days, you needed that kind of. It was so laborious to go and create that picture element that would juggle those things and only inject image elements and put sources on them in the right time so that not everything downloaded. But now, if you can make the hop, you can kind of build out things before they're there, so that you can forever sort of gracefully upgrade your markup just by virtue of coding it yourself. You can code these hooks in now. You have every affordance you need.
Yeah, my understanding is that was one of the reasons that this was made a thing, was so that developers would have a chance to prototype things before they actually come out, because things, the specs change so quickly. You want to make sure that they're implemented correctly. And this was a way that developers could prototype things that they came up with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's going to actually have far-reaching benefits that people may not even realize right now. Like, one big one that no one's really talking about, but we did internally on the working group when we were writing the specs or contributing to the specs, is what happens to the definition of the HTML spec in general going forward as far as markup and elements. Well, prior to this, we didn't really have a great way of knowing what was popular, what's necessary, what do developers need as far as new elements that we'll bring to native and make even faster. What we have in custom elements is this ability to scan the web like Google's parsers already do. They even did this. They did tests where we said, what custom elements are people using, right? And now we can actually resolve this. So if we say, gosh darn it, are accordions necessary on the web? Do we need the accordion element? Well, before when we were asking that question, we had to say, oh gosh, let's look at all these frameworks: Dojo, MooTools, jQuery, this, that, and the other thing. Let's check all the plugin repositories they have, which is a non-standard way, so we have to build crawlers for that. We'll grab all those plugins. We'll have to instantiate scripts, look at what that script is doing. Is it an accordion-looking thing? Did they even name it accordion? Maybe they named it some bespoke thing like people love to do with JS libraries. It's like, oh, it's accordion, but it's called popcorn or something. Who knows, right? So that was the old way, and you could never really glean information. Now that we're going towards a tag-based thing, which is awesome, or an is-attribute thing, we can say, let's have the crawlers go out and look for the most common custom elements, which are probably aptly named, at least accordion somewhere in there. And if that's something that's being used on 80% of large, forward-thinking web apps, maybe we should look at putting that in the HTML spec. Maybe we should let the community organically and virally inform us of what is important to them. And that's a question. Without custom elements, without a semantic declaration in markup, we would never really be able to ask efficiently.
It's something too you said too with this was about searchability, right? So there's something called a generator element, which webcomponents.org and Zenarocha put together, a bunch of other contributors as well, but there is an Xtag implementation on there. Is that up to date if people were going to build their own?
I am not sure if that one is 100% up to date. The API didn't change a ton going from 1.0.
Right.
The basics are still all the same, so I'll have to look at it and see kind of. I think it's much more verbose than it needs to be at this present time. But I'll go back and update that as a mental note. We actually have our own stub. So there's an Xtag stub. I think it's called a web component-stub. And if you download that, it has everything in it. We use Grunt and Bower, so basically npm install. Bower install goes and grabs the two libraries you need. If you're already using Polymer or the polyfills, you don't need any of that. You just need the Xtag library, which is tiny. It's like 10K or something. And once you do that, it kind of gives you the whole format. It has like an empty element that has each section. Everything's there for you, and it gives you a couple easy steps to go then and publish out to Bower if you wanted to evangelize your component.
Oh, on the README?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are always useful, getting a seed element like that. And it helps definitely for adoption. And searchability, I definitely encourage people when they're building custom elements to put it on custom elements IO and always tag it with web-components.
Yep.
So one of the things though that I wish we had was a tagging system. So if you're searching Bower for a particular type of component, we have real semantic ways of doing that. And currently we don't. If we don't create something like that, it'll end up like when you search for Angular in Bower.
Yeah.
Right? You get thousands of results.
Yep.
And that's just not useful. It's not helpful. So if we could come up as a community with some tagging system, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's brings up this. I've actually been not hating on, but I don't enjoy the idea that we have like 65 packagers, and it's like a packager a day seems to pop up. I'd love if we could wrap those things into something, and I think that leads to larger discussion on putting that back towards NPM or whatever that looks like, right?
Yeah, I know NPM is currently trying to become the package manager of choice for all JavaScript. So, I mean, maybe it'll end up being that. Maybe Bower will stick around for a while, or something else will come along. The Web Components JS polyfill is now available on NPM along with a bunch of other shared repositories, which is nice.
Yeah, and it's also cool to know that they actually there are those two packs. There's the light, and then there's the one in Shadow DOM. But they also break them out into almost all the way down into all the constituent parts. So you can get like just piecemeal each spec, which was something that I'd been asking for a while that I thought was important, because what happened, I think, is developers started equating platform polyfills with Polymer, and they really couldn't see that difference, the distinguishing thing, which I don't think it was meant as a marketing thing or anything, but it makes it difficult to unbind the two. So if someone says, oh, I don't like the way that Polymer elements works, gosh darn it, that's the platform. Or Xtag, if we did the same thing and they said, I don't like that imperative thing, I don't want that to reflect badly or turn them away from the polyfills, which are just these browser native things.
Rob Dodson has been working really hard to offset that misconception.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, they've done a good
Polymer's
job.
Doing a good job with it.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've reiterated it, and I think they've shown great faith. And people need to give Google a hand. A lot of times they get this sort of this rap now. It kind of, whenever you get big, this happens, sort of pop culture phenomenon. But they've done yeoman's work at Google on this spec. They've pushed it in the face of good and bad opposition, pushed forward with the right heart and spirit. I think these guys really want to make the web work. They present Chrome OS as like, hey, we're a startup. We're working with Android. We want to work with them, but we're also kind of competing at the same time, and we want to make the web every bit as good. And that's honestly, every time I sat in a room with those guys, they repeated that over and over again, that was their thing, and they acted it too. With
the way that Angular is moving towards web components, because that's the framework I'm most familiar with. Mm-hmm. Working on applications, it's interesting because the way that they're moving towards this, they're taking the approach of let's look at these specs separate and try and see how we can incorporate them into the idea of directives and work with other web components. So it's I think we're going to see some really interesting things with larger frameworks like that moving forward, rather than libraries like Polymer. And I don't know how you consider Xtag, but it seems like it's a library that's similar to Polymer.
Yeah, so what I look at Xtag as is a really lightweight library that will play nice with everyone. So Arron even uses Xtag with a couple, like a Vue library, a DOM library that he worked with that does the diffing, and it mixes in really well. Like you can mix them with Polymer, and that's the cool part about web components. Any of these libraries really mix well together once you've actually stamped your component out. It's all about how do you stamp your components out, right? Instead of how do you stamp it out and instantiate them. When you take that instantiation thing away, now you've sort of standardized the usage, which is the big main piece. Everything else is flavors and how you kind of prefer to describe them, right? Yeah. When you're actually creating the elements. So that's what we see Xtag as, is the easiest way to get into describing a custom element without a lot of overhead. You can add in some advanced features if you want, and will play nice off the bat with everyone. So we won't enforce upon you even new ways of importing elements or doing anything like that. All it is a script tag. Your elements are a script tag. Place them above or below depending on what your performance profile you want that to look like. And that's it. So you don't have to change any of your existing app dynamics. Like when you're thinking about your app and how you're constructing it, you don't have to do any of that. You just say, here's some elements, and I'll add them where they make sense.
Could you do that at a configuration level before Xtag loads, where you could say, mix in globally Shadow DOM for all of my custom elements?
So the way Shadow DOM works, the way we gave it to people was, like if you look at that custom element, maybe that input example or whatever, you'll see that the top level keys are mixins, lifecycles, methods. We have a shadow property, and so that shadow property takes the same content value. You can either do like a multi-line function comment, you can do string, you can do whatever you want.
Right.
It takes that same thing, and it explicitly makes it Shadow DOM when you tell it, and in the presence of either the native or polyfilled spec. So it's not like there's nothing right now where if you say, here's the content of a custom element, that my xfoo has this content, and with no Shadow DOM in play, it's not wrapped, it's just kind of light DOM. With Shadow DOM in play, then we wrap it. And the reason why we don't have like an auto configurator is because I started thinking about it, and it leads down this rabbit hole. Like, okay, so now you have to mark up your styles in two different ways, right? Like, because they're accessible differently. Either you have to use deep, basically you have to copy yourself twice. You either have to have for the light DOM, the regular CSS selectors for getting them, or deep or whatever it is once they're wrapped in Shadow DOM. And we just thought, just wait. I mean, honestly, like, there's so many elements you can use that will help you today that the complexity you add is I'm not going to say not worth it, but, it's a question that you need to have with your dev staff and, what your app's doing and what you...
Yeah, it's a great point of entry, though. I really like this idea of the mixins and how you've organized the ideas so that you're giving users, and developers in this case, a really good way to choose how they want to develop with the four specs.
Yeah.
So kudos to you. That's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
As far as testing these elements, is there a preferred way to do this? Like, do you do unit testing, or is there...
Yeah, we actually have a test framework that we use to test core. We use Jasmine. It's been good. We have it's really just for core and all the methods that hang off Xtag and element creation and events and stuff. You can definitely use Jasmine. We don't kind of make any recommendations on that. We kind of leave that up to you. Polymer has a good one that they use. They use Mocha and a couple other things. The reason why testing for us is not as important to kind of not mandate a solution, but even heavily suggest a solution, is because at the end of the day, really all you're testing is kind of, if you're using Xtag anyway, is these basic JavaScript affordances that you kind of wrap up in these hooks. And you can do that through pretty normal testing once the element's created. Like if you run an element through its paces, through like any of these testing libraries, as you would any other sort of widget you make, like in jQuery or whatever, you're going to get the same ability to be able to resolve bugs. So we don't think it's that important because we're introducing some simplistic semantic elements that are not overly complex.
What's the most interesting project you've seen done with Xtag?
I'm currently working on a couple, like one larger side project that I've just kind of kicked around in my spare time. That's definitely it fully utilizes custom elements everywhere. It's top to bottom. Kraken will have bits of Xtag inside of it, which is a trading thing. Hopefully they can get into their actual big trading interface, which would be amazing to see, like a real-time trading thing. I know Arron did a stock ticker, or kind of for Bitcoin. So it actually real-time updates, and you can just drop it in anywhere, and it knows how to go out and grab the ticker stuff. So all those things, he'll have spark lines in there at some point probably. Like those are coming up. We haven't spent a whole lot of time going out and evangelizing the companies or anything, just because I'm so busy at Target and stuff like that it's easier for the Polymer guys. They're actually employed to do this.
Well, I talked with when we had Potch and Solon, they're like the two people who are working on Brick, right? And you guys seem like you're the two core people working on Xtag. Polymer has more than two people, so they have quite a vast amount of resources at their foothold. So
they have more than two evangelists.
Yes, so it is great, and the community evangelizes it too because we get excited about it. And I hope more people get excited about all the projects with web components.
Yeah, I mean, I hope in the end, right, when this is native, like Xtag is so small, it's like 8K or something. I don't know what gzipped. It gets down below 8K, but once it's gzipped, like at that size, it's going to be so trivial. You're just going to be like, I'm going to include element from here and here, like you said on customelements.io,
Right.
and you're not going to need to worry about this as a developer. Just know that in the future, it's a bright future of custom elements, and no matter how you get them, you're going to be good. It's going to be easy, and you're not going to add a lot of weight to your app.
I would like to see, though, not just for Xtag, but all web components too, something that'll show off, some really great applications that have been built with all the different frameworks. There is one for Polymer called Built with Polymer by the guys over at DivShot, and that's a great application to take a look at.
Was the Chrome Dev Summit app, but it was material design, but I don't know if it was Polymer.
Well, I don't know for sure. I know they had that Polymail or whatever it is, the Gmail one, and they had the Santa one that was recent. That's going to be open sourced at some point, the Santa tracker.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I put out things now and then. I think you'll see something coming out, soon in the next few months that hopefully is intriguing and looks pretty cool.
Even if it's like a mini thing on Target's site, like some mini section. I mean, when I was in e-commerce, I did a lot of, like it would be almost like a mini application on a section. Like I worked at a big toy store company, and we had the Muppets, where they had this special Muppet thing that came out, and so we had one whole page that was like an application to build your own Muppet, and something like that was like would have lent itself well to custom
Well, I think you can. So maybe this is something I can actually add to here. It's a good point, and I think we might actually do that, because one thing I'm working on right now that might be interesting, not components, but with W3 we're trying to work on a web search standard, so an ability to interact with a search API from a domain, whatever flavor you choose. Maybe certain domains have multiple things, like GitHub, you could search repositories or users, but an easy way to search a contextual noun from a site with an open API that's cross-origin capable. Once we have that piece, I could, for instance, see, and we've kicked around to show off the implementation of web search for Target, having a component where maybe it's like a little search target, and it gives you a little list of products on a site that may be retail oriented or that would benefit from having that retail presence. So that's something that when we're thinking about this web search and how to get it out there, web search is great, but it's imperative and it doesn't do anything unless you use it. So I think that's the route we might go, is using a set of custom elements to kind of get our products out there to consumers.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Q3 next year or this year? Next year.
I think we've made some good progress. We have a couple partners that are significant. One retail, another one that I'll be speaking with up in San Francisco this week on web search that developers know very well. So if they're keen on implementing, it's very easy to polyfill, we could see search done and then those custom elements made probably Q3 next year, I think.
So if people want to find you or talk more about web components, learn more about Xtag, contribute, help out with the project, I'm sure you guys are totally open to contributors helping.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you get a hold of us right on through GitHub, GitHub's a great means to get a hold of me. If you want to reach out, I'll include my email obviously with the podcast. It's probably a great way. I'm fine with it being out there. I'm not so popular that I'm going to get that much email.
No social security numbers though.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely there'll be ways to connect. We're looking for contributors. So if you want to write a mixin that potentially we're going to use across a bunch of elements, we're coming out. God, I can't believe I waited. We're coming out with an XUI library sometime this next year, in the first half of this next year, that we think is going to be pretty compelling. I'm not going to say it's going to be head to toe like material design and have all these hundreds of designers pouring over it, but it'll be all custom elements. So that's something that we'd love contributors for. So yeah, absolutely.
Is that going to be on the Xtag repository space?
Yeah, it'll be out there in the Xtag organization on GitHub. We're also going to be transitioning, here's a huge piece, over to readme.io, which is Gregory Koberger's excellent startup. It's great for documentation. We're using that. It's fantastic. So we're going to transfer the xtags.org site. It's just going to really point at our readme.io site. So that's where you're going to find documentation and all the resources you need.
And for developers who want to get started with Xtag, is that the best place to start at?
Yeah. Readme.io has the completely up-to-date API stuff. I'm constantly adding things there. His app makes it really easy to do that and kind of bang out documentation simply. And that's where I would go.
And your Twitter handle, if people want to catch you on there?
It's CSU Wildcat. I will put out the caveat that I'm a libertarian. So every once in a while you'll catch some like libertarian stuff. So you might want to put me on a list, or just that new favorite feature. Just a word of the wise.
I don't know. I see more Seahawks stuff than I see that.
Yeah, libertarian Seahawks for sure. Yeah, so if you hate football, it's another. You just list it. Go web components guy. Just view it occasionally.
All right. Well, thanks. It's been a really great conversation. I really appreciate talking with you about Xtag. It's a really, really cool library. I'm looking forward to playing with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having us. And we're just interested in getting the word out for web components. So tell your viewers if there's any questions. Again, come to me. Go to the Polymer guys. They have great support there, and just get into it.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. Bye. This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.